Thanks for the introduction. My name is Mitch. I'm out of Texas Parks and Wildlife, Inland Fisheries. I'm in the San Antonio District Office. I want to take some time to acknowledge my co-authors, Randy Meyers, Greg Binion, and Dustin McDonald, as well as our funding source through the Sport Fish Restoration Act. So to get you up to speed on Texas catfishing, we manage blues and channel catfish under the same statewide harvest regulation, the 25 fish aggregate daily bag limit, and a 305 minimum total length limit, which is 12 inches. We drafted a catfish management plan back in 2015 to kind of guide our efforts moving forward. And through that, we are currently undergoing a development of new catfish regulations across the state. We have 11 special regulations for catfish. We're trying to reduce the complexity for our anglers. We use various minimum length limits, daily bag limits, we have slot limits, graduated bags, just trying to reduce that number a little bit. So for our study objectives, we wanted to characterize catfish harvest in Texas reservoirs, managing the statewide harvest regulation. And then on a select few reservoirs that we have long-term Creel data sets, we wanted to evaluate for temporal differences in catfish harvest size structure, and then look at how legal release changed, as well as estimate the impacts of alternative minimum length and daily bags using a theoretical harvest reduction model. It's kind of similar to a stringer table if you've worked with that before. So what we did, I ran every creel that's been done in Texas, and then we filtered out lakes that didn't have any directed effort for catfish, or some of our smaller reservoirs like urban fishing ponds that sometimes have a different sampling protocol. So what we ended up with was 226 creel surveys that cover 90 reservoirs spanning 16 years. And so that's the distribution of our reservoirs that have done creel surveys. Not a lot for West Texas, we just don't have a lot of water out there. So all of these reservoirs are greater than 250 acres. Our creel surveys last for 3 months or a single quarter, but they can last for up to a full year. And we use both angler access point surveys as well as roving creel surveys. And for reservoirs that picked one of those sampling methods, they stuck with that over the entire 16 years. So from those creel surveys, we pulled a lot of important variables. So we pulled the harvest number, length of harvest, we record that in inches, but for our analysis, we convert it over to millimeters. Number of released fish, which are grouped into two different size categories. It's either fish that are above the legal limit or below the legal limit. And then we also look at party size. We also want to know harvest biomass, so we use species-specific weight-length relationships that we gather from our population survey data, so we can assign a weight to every fish that was harvested. And in order to make comparisons between our reservoirs and within a reservoir over time, we want to standardize the data. So we use number of quarters as well as reservoir size in hectares. Most of our reservoirs, the water level is tracked over time, and using stage area curves, you can gain an idea of how big the reservoir are at any time. So for each of the creel surveys, I went and gathered the average reservoir size so that we can make comparisons. So we end up with two harvest statistics. We call it HHQ and BHQ. So HHQ is harvest number per hectare per quarter, and BHQ is biomass in kilograms per hectare per quarter. And then when we looked at legal release, we used PLR, portion legal release, so it's the voluntary release of legal size catfish. So it's different than mandatory release where you have to throw back sublegal fish. These are fish that anglers elected to get rid of that were legal size. So what this harvest data looks like is, we hear a lot about blue catfish. We got a lot of big blue cats in Texas, but it's still channel catfish dominated. 69% of our harvest is channels, 31% is blues. The dots here on the screen show all different reservoirs, more different circle colors. It's when a lake is predominantly a single species of catfish, so it's not a total harvest, but 75% of harvest of channel catfish equates to a brown. Blue catfish are blue circles, and then when it's a fairly even split for harvest, it's white. So it's a pretty even spread, just not a lot of big blue catfish lakes. So these are the two standardized creel estimates we came up with, the HHQ and BHQ. And as you can see, they're both right skewed. They play off each other a little bit with a median of around 0.6. And I think it's 60% of our reservoirs have an HHQ below 1, which we consider low harvest. And the dashed line represents our high harvest mark. If you listened to Nate's talk earlier, you found that we don't have a lot of estimates of exploitation in Texas. So we kind of estimate exploitation using some of the literature out there. Stewart had come up with an exploitation around 30% can lead to some degradation in size structure or over harvest. And Miranda back in the 80s surveyed 108 lakes, I believe it was, and got standing crop estimates. And so a 30% exploitation on those estimates would equate to about 3 fish per quarter coming out of the lake, or 3 kilograms. So we know that as high harvest. And we have about 20% of our lakes in Texas correspond to that high harvest mark. So if you look at our harvest size distribution, we've measured a ton of catfish over time. But we saw a minimal difference in mean harvest size between the two species. We also want to look at catfish that are below and above 16 inches. 16 inches is a pretty important mark for catfish. It's the quality size designation for channels. And in our English surveys, for blue catfish, that's the lowest size that anglers say they want to harvest. We have a pretty even split. About 50% of our fish are below that 16-inch mark and 50% are greater than that. Our preferred size catfish don't constitute a very large portion of the harvest. For channels, it's a 610 millimeter or 24 inches. And on a per lake basis, 0 to 8% of the harvest constitutes that, with a median of 0, where they don't offer that fishing. And for blue catfish, it's 0 to 2% with a median at 0. When we look at our proportion of legal release results, the voluntary release of legal sized catfish, we think of catfish as a harvest species. We kind of see this in the data also. We do have a wide range from 0 to 0.98, but the median's at 0.13, meaning 87% of the fish that are caught are catfish that are of legal size. And 75% of our reservoirs have PLR of 0.21 or lower. So we see it as a harvest species in Texas. Now we do have 4 reservoirs that, on that map of 90 reservoirs, that are a special regulation lake. And those 4 lakes all had no minimum lengths for catfish, which are different than the standard statewide. And we had creels that were both before and after that minimum length was removed. And we want to see how PLR changed. So before that minimum length was taken off, they had a PLR that matched most of the statewide lakes with 0.11. After removal, it jumped up to 0.58. We think that makes sense to us. A lot more of those fish are now legal. Anything below 12 is considered a legal fish. And there's instances where they're throwing those back. And so it increased PLR. We also want to see how what the harvest looked like once the minimum was taken away. And so we looked at percent of harvest of fish lower than 305 millimeters, 12 inches. And there was quite a big range there. So on a lake like Tawakoni, which has kind of the reputation to be a trophy catfish lake, only about 3% of the harvest was of small catfish. But on lakes like Kirby or Palestine, it can be up to 40%. Some of those are special regs that were put in to increase harvest of small fish. And so they do what we expect them to do, is now they're harvesting a lot of the small fish. But it's important to know that there's potential for a large increase in harvest if you take off that minimum length. Switching gears to look at some of those long-term data sets that we have for our creels, we have 4 reservoirs. Choke Canyon, which if you listen to Greg Binion's talk, we'll touch on that. Lake Fork, Lake Conroe, and Lake Sam Rayburn. All of these had 5+ creels over a 10-year span, and they're all managed in the statewide harvest regulation. Choke Canyon is different than the other 3, where it's a predominantly blue cat fishery, where the other 3 are mainly channel catfish. And so for those, we wanted to see how harvest size structure changed over time, as well as percent legal release. And then we used the theoretical harvest reduction model to compare impacts of various regulations. So if we take a look at the size structure and how that changed, we used a Bayes logistic regression, where we looked at the proportion of fish that were less than 60 inches and how that changed over time. And we had 2 significant results at Choke Canyon and Lake Fork. If you look at the HHQ values that are posted there, they're both over 3. Those are both high harvest systems. And so it's led to a degradation in size quality over time, where at Choke Canyon, about 45% of the fish back in 2005 were less than 60 inches, and now it's up near 85%. At Lake Fork, we see a similar trend where it was down around 25%, and now it's up near 65-70%. Now, we do know that the high harvest does not always equate to a degradation in size structure. Lake Conroe has similar harvest levels at HHQ to Choke Canyon, but as you can see, less than 50% of the harvest is those smaller fish. They have great size structure there. Most of the harvested fish, greater than 16 inches. Size structure has been looking good over time. And we also know that you can have a low harvest system, but still have poor quality for size structure. Where Sam Rayburn has an HHQ of 0.6, but up near 90% of their fish there are smaller, they're less than 16 inches. If we want to take a closer look at choke canyon over time, this is the proportion of harvest for each of these different size classes over time. Back in 2006, 2007, and 2008, up till about 2010, they had pretty good size structure. And then over time, you can see it just kind of shifted towards smaller and smaller fish. That blue line is that 16-inch marker, the 406 millimeters. So over time, it's kind of trended towards those smaller fish. In our most recent Creel survey in 2018, it may be bouncing back a little bit, which is a good sign. It's a little bit of a different story at Lake Fork. Their size structure has kind of fluctuated over time. It's looked great in 2006, pretty good in 2009, and then right around 2012, 2014 is where we start to see it trail off a little bit. And now in 2018, most of those fish are below that 16-inch mark. We wanted to look at how percent legal release changed. We used that same beta logistic regression, and the only significant result was at Lake Fork. And over time, PLR has increased as the size structure has faded off, as you say. And so, more anglers are willing to throw back fish now that they're catching smaller fish. When we look at our angler harvest data, which is important for the theoretical harvest reduction, you can see that most anglers aren't keeping too many fish. The median angler harvest is 3 fish, which is significantly lower than the daily bag limit. And 64% of our anglers harvest fewer than 5 fish on a trip. And these are at some of our most successful catfish fisheries. So when we look at the THR models, we're able to estimate the impacts on harvest had a different regulation been in effect. So if you had a daily bag limit of 10 fish, and you caught all 10 fish, and we can model what a 5-fish daily bag would look like. And we can do that for various minimum lengths. We can do it for a removal of the minimum length. We can do graduated bags or slot limits. We're going to calculate each angler party catch individually and then sum it all up. So when we model the removal of the minimum length, we expect harvest to increase because now there's fish that they can keep that they previously couldn't. So we use that PLR value from the lakes with no minimum length, which was, they had PLR 0.58. So now we were able to add fish back in using their released fish at a rate equal to 1 minus PLR. And so what that looks like is 42% of the fish that they had thrown back, we estimate they would have kept. So these are the results of our THR model for those 4 lakes. You can see that as you reduce the daily bag for Choke, Conroe, and Sam Rayburn and Lake Fork, it's all a pretty similar result. They're not keeping a whole lot of fish, so you're not going to have a big impact on harvest, for reducing harvest by lowering the daily bag until you get down to 5 or 10 fish, and even then you only see a 25% reduction. Minimum length is a lot more size structure dependent, where if you were to increase the minimum length from 305 or 12 inches to 356 to 14 inches, you'd see a vastly different result. Harvest at Lake Conroe would only decrease like 5-10%, where a lake like Sam Rayburn, where they have pretty poor size structure, you can see a 50% reduction in harvest. So it's just important to know your size structure when you make these changes. Now when we remove the minimum length limit, you're also going to see some bigger results. So a lake like Conroe, where there's a lot of big fish, not a lot of small fish thrown back, by removing the minimum length, you're not going to see a larger increase in harvest, maybe 5%. But for a lake like Choke Canyon or Sam Rayburn, where there's a lot of small fish, you can increase harvest up to 30-40%. And if you wanted to, if you really like the no minimum length idea, but you want to maintain harvest, you'd have to reduce your bag limits down to 5 to 10 fish, which might not be acceptable to your anglers. So this is what one of these THR model results looks like. It's combining different daily bag limits with minimum length restrictions. And the dashed line indicates our current regulation, and everything else is going to be a change in harvest with standard errors in the parentheses. And it kind of shows that you can get multiple changes in harvest with different combinations of regulations. So choke canyon was a high harvest system with an HHQ or BHQ around 3, which would be detrimental to their size structure. And so if you want to get down to levels around 2 or lower, you might want a 3% reduction in harvest. So there's 2 ways you could do that. You could increase your minimum length, keeping your bag limit at 15 or 25 and get that 30% reduction. Or if you like that 12-inch minimum length limit, you can keep that but reduce the bag down to 5, just whatever your anglers are more accepting for. So our conclusions were that no minimum length is going to be suitable for the majority of our reservoirs. 60% of our reservoirs had an HHQ less than 1. So an increase in harvest at any level up to 40% isn't going to raise your HHQ value to a level that's detrimental. So that works for most places. But when we had those long-term Creel data sets, we did identify 2 reservoirs where size structure truncated over time, which is emblematic of growth overfishing. We don't have the growth data to back it up. We're in the process of creating a project that will take a look at that, but there's some concern there. And we believe that THR can be a useful tool to evaluate regulation options when your growth data is limited. Growth data can be super beneficial. You can do age structure models, you can do a lot, but we don't have a lot of growth data in Texas. We do have Creel data, and we know harvest. So you can use that THR to take a look at that. So I think I have some time for questions.
Thanks, Mitch.